you do talk about the unique positioning of the business in terms of being able to supply critical materials that oftentimes are being controlled by China.
Well, there is an established supply chain in critical minerals that is dominantly in China. Over 90% of the mining, as well as the midstream processing, as well as the magnet production, is all sitting in that jurisdiction. So, our proposition is to provide an alternative supply chain for countries to be able to have some choice about actually where they're taking the product from.
And we're talking countries like Australia, like allies like the US, right? And both of these governments have made this, a critical policy priority in terms of being able to secure the supply. So how has ISM benefited or been part of that?
Yeah, so I would mention Korea and Europe, as well as Japan and the US, working with Australia to develop this alternative supply chain. I think COVID taught a lot of lessons about the vulnerability when you allow one supply chain to really dominate. And these countries recognise that they saw disruption for this supply chain in particular during that period. So there's a lot of policy, a lot of urgency around establishing the alternative, and it's in part to just provide some diversity, but it's also to enable growth, because the end market for these products is anticipated to grow very strongly over the next 5 to 10 years. The electric vehicles, but also the wind turbines, a lot of those clean technologies. And there is insufficient demand. So, you mentioned the geopolitical sort of stresses, but it's also just a straight demand-supply story as well. Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes. So, what we're seeing is a lot of policy to incentivise investment in both the mines, but also the processing of these materials to be able to feed into those end user industries.
What is the time frame? When do you expect to see production?
Well, for Dubbo, we're working at the moment on talking to off-takers and finalising funding. We're targeting to reach final investment decision by the end of next calendar year, and that will see us with first production early in 27.
What about customer base?
So one of the advantages for ASM is that we will take the product all the way from mine through to metal. So when I was talking about first production in 27, I'm talking about the mine here in New South Wales. But we've taken the unusual step of building the metals plant, which is the next step in the supply chain first. So that is already built and in production in Korea. And we're working with emerging magnet producers in Korea, in the US, and in Europe at the moment, doing our customer qualification process. So we're getting quite a wide range of customers, and they themselves are the suppliers into those big OEMs.
Does that sort of vertical integration hopefully contain costs?
Well, there's a few reasons why you do it, but one of the reasons that you do it is because if you don't actually work collaboratively to establish the end-to-end supply chain, your product has to go back into the existing supply chain, and you're not necessarily going to see it come back out again. So it is important, if we're making this effort at the front end, to make sure that there's a pathway all the way through to customer. But then, absolutely, as you say, if you're only going to play in one piece of that supply chain, you run the risk of being squeezed. So minimising the number of parties across that supply chain and developing strategic relationships so you can have sensible discussions about how you share margin across that supply chain also protects your business through particularly this first 10 years of establishing this alternative industry.
We talked a little bit about just the fundamentals of supply and demand. If China is controlling 90% of what we see in terms of the raw materials, my simple question would be, do you think there's enough outside of that to be able to drive the energy transition?
Well, there's not enough today, absolutely, but that's why this is such an important opportunity for us to pursue. And what we're seeing, like I was in Washington last week and Detroit, and one of the conversations I had with one of the auto industry advisors, they were talking about, the tax incentives that are there in the US to incentivize the auto producers to use non-China product. And he said, it's not just the growth in the total EV market, but it's actually the movement away from the established supply chain that's going to make a difference. And he said, as of today, only 20% of the EVs on the market in the US would be compliant with those tax breaks that are going to come into effect at the end of next year. So we're going to see the end users not just growing in their volume, but also really wanting to move toward this alternative supply chain. But to be able to meet that demand, we're going to have to move rapidly.
We have seen the government engagement through the Inflation Reduction Act, through the critical materials strategy. How much engagement have you had with the government, and what would you like to see, I guess, policy-wise, to be able to ramp that up and in a timely manner that actually meets these deadlines?
Well, one of the reasons why I was in Washington last week is I was there as part of the round table with the Prime Minister when he announced the $2 billion that's going into the critical minerals facility. My comment would be that I think the Australian government, both federally and what we're seeing at state level, there's a lot of attention being spent on how to really accelerate the development of critical minerals in Australia through partnerships with allied countries, and it was very evident last week. Sitting at the table with the Prime Minister and with Secretary Raimondo, you could see the urgency, you could see the intent, you could see the alignment on how do we actually work together to play to each other's strengths to make this happen.